China is ramping up energy security as the Iran war shakes the global economy. That is the headline, but that is not yet the structure. By the end of this, you will have the answer. Before I go further, I want to know where you are watching this from and what your structural reading of this is. Put it in the comments, and stay until the end, because the data point in the final report changes how this entire story reads. Let me be precise about this. China's leadership has pledged to strengthen energy security and accelerate technological self-reliance. This was not said in isolation. It was stated in the context of rising external risks linked to a conflict involving Iran. The Politburo identified disruptions to energy supplies and supply chains as key pressures. At the same time, officials reported steady economic growth while acknowledging increasing global uncertainty. The response? Focus on stability, resilience, domestic production, and infrastructure. Here is what the data actually shows. China is not reacting to a single event. It is responding to a category of risk. Energy supply disruptions are not new. Supply chain instability is not new. What is changing is the frequency and convergence of these pressures. Today's news is yesterday's decision, finally visible. To understand why Beijing made this decision, you have to understand the context. China's economy is deeply integrated into global supply chains. Its industrial system depends on stable inputs: energy, raw materials, logistics. When a conflict involving Iran begins to affect global energy flows, the concern in Beijing is not theoretical, it is operational. And this is where the analysis has to be very careful, because the next part is where most people draw the wrong conclusion. This is not about panic. There is no indication of sudden instability in China's economy. The official statement emphasizes steady growth. That is important. The concern is not immediate collapse. The concern is exposure to external shocks. Think carefully about what that means. China is identifying vulnerability not in current performance, but in future disruption pathways. Risk is not what has happened. It is what can no longer be controlled. The Politburo's language matters. Rising external risks, disruptions to energy supplies, disruptions to supply chains. These are structural phrases. They are not reactive statements. They indicate a shift in how Beijing is categorizing the global environment. This is not what most people think it is. Many will read this as a response to a specific war, but the structure is broader. The Iran conflict is a trigger, not the foundation. The foundation is a global system that is becoming less predictable, less stable, and more fragmented. And this is the part of the story that almost no one in Western media is explaining accurately. China is not simply reacting to instability. It is preparing for continuity of instability. Let me be very precise about this. When Chinese officials emphasize technological self-reliance, they are not making an abstract statement. They are linking energy security with technological capability. Infrastructure, domestic production, and technological capacity are being treated as a single system. That is the shift. Security in this context is not military, it is systemic. The history here is essential. China has long pursued economic integration with global markets. That integration created growth, but it also created dependency. Dependency on external energy supplies, dependency on global logistics networks, dependency on stable geopolitical conditions. What we are seeing now is not a rejection of that model, it is an adjustment to its risks. And this was not inevitable. It became likely through a series of specific decisions, not only in Beijing, but globally. Energy markets have become more volatile. Supply chains have become more exposed to geopolitical friction. Conflicts in key regions now have wider economic consequences. The Iran conflict is one such node. It affects energy flows, it affects pricing, it affects perception of risk. Perception of risk often moves faster than the risk itself. And this is where the structural question begins to form. China reports steady growth, yet it emphasizes uncertainty. It accelerates self-reliance. It invests in domestic production. It prepares for disruptions that have not yet fully materialized. Why? Because the system it depends on is no longer behaving predictably. And this leads us to the central analytical question. If China is not reacting to immediate crisis, but to anticipated instability, what does that tell us about how Beijing now reads the global system? And more importantly, how does that reading differ from how Washington and others are interpreting the same environment? Strategy is always clearer in the archive than in the moment. That is the question we now have to answer. The strategic logic begins with a simple observation. China is not responding to the Iran conflict as an isolated event. It is treating it as a signal within a larger pattern. Let me be precise about this. Beijing's calculation is structured around continuity of disruption. The Politburo's identification of rising external risks is not tied to a single geography. It reflects an assessment that global systems, energy, supply chains, logistics, are entering a phase of repeated shocks. This is not new. In earlier periods, China faced external volatility, but operated within a system that ultimately stabilized. What is different now is the expectation that instability may persist. Patterns matter more than incidents. To understand why Beijing is emphasizing energy security, you have to understand the role energy plays in China's economic structure. China is a large-scale industrial economy. That requires consistent energy input. Disruption at that level does not simply raise costs. It creates uncertainty across the entire production system. So when the Politburo speaks about disruptions to energy supplies, it is not referring to temporary inconvenience. It is identifying a structural vulnerability. And this is where the analysis has to be very careful, because the next part is where most people draw the wrong conclusion. Many interpret this as defensive. That is only partially correct. Beijing is not only trying to shield itself from disruption, it is also trying to reduce its exposure to external leverage. Energy dependence, when tied to unstable regions, creates strategic constraints. Dependence is rarely neutral. It carries conditions. At the same time, technological self-reliance is being accelerated. This is not a separate policy. It is directly linked to energy security. Infrastructure, domestic production, and technological capability form a single integrated response. Think carefully about what that means. China is attempting to internalize critical systems that were previously externalized. That includes energy production capacity, infrastructure resilience, and technological independence. These are long-term strategies. They do not produce immediate results, but they reduce vulnerability over time. Now consider Washington's reading of this. Washington often interprets moves toward self-reliance as strategic competition. In that framework, China's actions are seen as attempts to decouple or gain advantage. Beijing reads the same actions differently. It sees them as necessary adjustments to an increasingly uncertain external environment. Washington calls this strategic positioning. Beijing calls this risk management. Both sides are responding rationally. They are responding to different risk maps. And this is the part of the story that almost no one is explaining accurately. The divergence is not only in policy, it is in perception. From Beijing's perspective, the global system is becoming less reliable. Conflicts like the one involving Iran reinforce that view. Energy disruptions are not hypothetical. They are observable. From Washington's perspective, China's response signals long-term strategic ambition. Self-reliance is interpreted as preparation for competition. Both readings follow internal logic, but the interaction of those logics creates friction. Let me be very precise about this. China's emphasis on stability and resilience is not a temporary policy adjustment. It is being institutionalized. Domestic production is being prioritized. Infrastructure is being expanded. Technological capacity is being developed internally. These are not short-term reactions. They are structural shifts. We have seen this before. Systems adapt before they break. And there is a data point in this story that changes the structural picture entirely. China reported steady economic growth while simultaneously highlighting increasing global uncertainty. This dual statement is critical. It tells us that the current system is still functioning, but confidence in its future stability is declining. That distinction matters, because it explains why Beijing is acting now rather than waiting for disruption to fully materialize. Action precedes crisis when risk becomes visible. And this is where the structural logic becomes clear. China is not waiting for energy supply disruptions to fully impact its economy. It is moving preemptively to reduce exposure. That includes boosting domestic production, expanding infrastructure, accelerating technological self-reliance. Each of these actions reduces dependence on external systems. Now consider the broader implication. If China reduces its dependence on global supply chains and energy flows, the nature of its economic interaction with the world changes. Not immediately, but gradually. And this is not a unilateral process. Other countries observing the same instability may reach similar conclusions. Adaptation spreads faster than coordination, which brings us to the final layer of strategic logic. The global system that enabled decades of integration is now being reassessed by its participants. China is one of them, not the only one. But its scale makes its decisions structurally significant. And this leads directly to the conclusion we now have to examine. If major economies begin restructuring around resilience rather than efficiency, what happens to the system that was built on interdependence? Miscalculation requires no malice, only two different definitions of acceptable risk. That is the question that defines the next report. China's decision to ramp up energy security in response to pressures linked to the Iran conflict is not an isolated policy adjustment. It is evidence of a system recalibrating under conditions of sustained uncertainty. Let me be very precise about this. The facts are straightforward. China's leadership has identified rising external risks. It has pointed to disruptions in energy supplies and supply chains. It has emphasized domestic production, infrastructure expansion, and technological self-reliance. At the same time, it has reported steady economic growth while acknowledging increasing global uncertainty. Those facts, taken together, define the structure. Stability today does not guarantee stability tomorrow. This is not what most people think it is. Many will interpret this as a reaction to a specific geopolitical event, but the evidence does not support that narrow reading. The Iran conflict is a trigger point. The response is broader. It is directed at the underlying condition, a global system that no longer provides predictable continuity. And this is where the analysis has to be very careful, because the next part is where most people draw the wrong conclusion. China is not withdrawing from the global economy. There is no indication of that. It continues to report steady growth. It continues to operate within global systems. But it is reducing its exposure to their volatility. That distinction is critical. Integration can continue even as dependence is reduced. Think carefully about what that means. A system built on interdependence assumes stability. When that stability is questioned, actors begin to adjust. They do not exit the system immediately. They change how they participate in it. China's focus on resilience reflects that shift. Domestic production reduces reliance on external inputs. Infrastructure strengthens internal capacity. Technological self-reliance limits vulnerability to disruptions beyond its control. Each of these moves is incremental, but their cumulative effect is structural. We have seen this pattern before. Adjustment begins quietly, then becomes visible. Now consider the broader arc. For decades, the global economic system operated on efficiency. Production was distributed, supply chains were optimized, energy flows were assumed to be reliable. What happens when that assumption weakens? The answer is not theoretical, it is observable. China's response is one example. It is aligning its policies towards stability rather than maximum efficiency. That means accepting potential costs in exchange for reduced risk. Efficiency maximizes output, resilience maximizes survival. And this is the part of the story that almost no one is explaining accurately. This shift is not limited to one country. It reflects a wider reassessment of global systems. When disruptions to energy supplies and supply chains become more frequent, the logic of participation changes. Countries begin to ask a different question. Not, how do we optimize growth, but how do we maintain continuity under stress? That is a structural change. Let me be very precise about this. China's emphasis on energy security is not only about securing fuel, it is about ensuring that its economic system can function under conditions of external instability. That includes conflicts it does not control. The Iran conflict is one such example. It affects energy flows. It introduces uncertainty into global markets. It reinforces the perception that external systems cannot be fully relied upon. Perception, once changed, becomes policy. And this is where the structural conclusion becomes unavoidable. China is preparing for a world in which external shocks are not exceptions, but recurring features. It is building capacity to absorb those shocks internally. That is the logic behind domestic production, behind infrastructure expansion, behind technological self-reliance. Each policy aligns with that expectation. Systems do not wait for certainty, they adapt to probability. Now return to the starting point. China ramps up energy security as the Iran war shakes the global economy. That is the visible event. The underlying structure is different. China is adjusting to a global system that is becoming less predictable, less stable, and more fragmented. And it is doing so while maintaining current economic performance. That combination, stability in the present, adjustment for the future, is the defining feature of this moment. Structural forces do not require bad intentions to produce bad outcomes. The conclusion then is direct. China's actions show that the global system is no longer being treated as reliably stable by its largest participants.